Hello, everyone. Welcome to video 2 of chapter 7. So we've been introduced to property income, but the first thing we're going to discuss is interest, a passive nature of property. When can we deduct it from our income? So share screen. Interest must be charged pursuant to a legal obligation where interest rate is specified when and how interest is to be paid. Interest must relate to either borrowed funds, where funds are used to either earn a business or income property, business or property income, or amount payable for purchase of property used to earn a source of income from business or property. So why does it say all that? An individual might have multiple loans. I could have a mortgage on my house. I could have a loan on my vehicle, and then I might take out a loan to run a business. Property income is income that comes from owning a piece of property. So if I take out a loan and use the funds pursuant to income, then the interest from that loan can be deducted. The interest I pay for my car loan cannot be deducted because it doesn't relate to a source of income. This is my personal benefit. I took out the loan to help me buy this thing for me that I want. But when I took out a loan and used the money to invest into an income source, then I can deduct the interest against the income that that loan was used for. There's this concept of direct use, and I'll talk about it more in a moment. Interest rate to be deductible must be part of a deal. When you get a loan, in that loan agreement says, in exchange for using my funds, you will pay me a certain rate based on the balance, and you will pay me monthly or annually. So those details are usually part of the contract. And the reason they rely on this is because how much interest you have to pay needs to be identified when the loan is given. If they said, okay, here's $10,000, and you're like, great, and 6 months down the line, they're like, all right, here's the 10,000 back, and they're like, whoa, 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 you owe me 12. It's like, hold on, we never agreed to that. So when you take a loan, usually the interest rate or the conditions of that loan are agreed to at the onset. The legal relationship established for a loan or other type of indebtedness, unpaid rent, trade accounts receivable, unpaid interest. When you have a business, you might have some accounts payable. You've bought some product, the invoices, you have 30 days to pay. Many invoices will have some small print on it that says, if you do not pay within 30 or 60 days, we will charge you interest of X%. And their invoice needs to state that interest rate in order for them to charge you interest. So if it does, by not paying that invoice, you are sort of in effect agreeing to pay out that interest amount. So these legal relationships relate to loans where you've agreed to borrow balance or indebtedness. So by not paying that invoice, it's almost as though that supplier is providing you a short-term loan. CRA and courts generally consider interest to be capital in nature, therefore disallowed by Tax Act 18. Interest expense is determined by Tax Act 20. So what is interest? Interest is a amount owing on a balance well, how do I word this? The interest you pay is a portion that's reimbursement or compensation for using a certain amount of money. If I loan you $10, you're going to pay me back $10. But while you have my $10, I have opportunity costs. I'm out that 10. I can't use it while you have it in your possession. And also, because of the time value of money, that $10 is losing value for as long as you have it. So in order for me to give up access to my $10, you need to compensate me in some way. So interest is the compensation based on time for how long you have my money from me. It's calculated on a day-to-day accrual basis. It's calculated on a principal sum or the right to a principal sum. So interest is usually a percentage. We apply that percentage to the principal sum, and principal usually relates to that physical amount that was originally loaned. Compensation for use of the principal sum or right to the principal sum. The Tax Act can deem amounts to be interest. This occurs for leased vehicles. So when you have a leased vehicle, you take on a vehicle and you usually have to pay lease payments. Now, that lease payment is partly paying off the vehicle. It's almost like they've loaned you the money for the vehicle, but included in that payment is a profit portion. We also consider that profit portion, we call it the intrinsic interest rate, the interest rate that's baked into the payment plan. So Income Tax Act can deem certain amounts to be interest if they're paid on a continuous basis and are very much based on a principal sum. So here comes the direct use method. So direct use must be considered. There's a court case where an individual withdrew $300,000 from their partnership in which he was a member. So he had a business. I think it was a law firm. I think it was a law firm he was a partner in. So he had the law firm loan him $300,000 and he used the money to buy a home. He then borrowed $300,000 from the bank, and the bank's charging interest, and he invested that $300,000 into the partnership, replacing the funds withdrawn. The direct use to invest capital in partnership, indirectly, he used it to finance the home. Instead of taking the mortgage and buying a home with it, he took money from the business to buy the home, and then the loan from the bank was put into the business. So the case that went to court was the CRA, the government was saying, well, really that $300,000 was used to buy his home. That was the indirect use of it. Yes, he physically took the money and put it in the business, but he was just replacing funds used to buy a home. Um, and the court's decision was the economic reality cannot override direct use. Because that loan directly went to the business, the interest that comes from it was deductible. The Queen versus Ludco is another court case, borrowed to make investment. While the real goal was a capital gain, the investment paid dividends. So when you buy shares in a corporation, you hope the price of those shares go up. Let's say I buy a share of Google for $10. I want the value of that share to go to $15 because I paid $10 for it, but if the price goes to 15, I can sell it. I've made $5. So I purchased this share for the purpose of reselling at a profit. Someone took out a loan to buy the share. They took out a loan, they bought the share, and so the government made the case of, well, it wasn't pursuant to business or property income because he bought the share to get a capital gain. For interest to be deductible, it has to relate to business or property income. So the court's decision was investments can have multiple purposes. Yes, he bought the share to get a capital gain, but shares provide the right to dividend income. And if that company, if Google had declared a dividend amount, I would have gotten my dividend. So now I would have had property income. So investments can have multiple purposes. I can buy a share because I want the dividends and potentially get a capital gain. The Supreme Court of Canada concluded the investments owned by Ludco constituted a source of property income. Therefore, the interest on the borrowed money was fully deductible. Even though he never got a dividend, because the share had that potential, had that right, it could be established that it was property income or it was intended for property income. There's a third case called tracing. The Supreme Court of Canada for the Bronfman Trust, the beneficiary requested a large cash distribution from the trust. The trust did not have the cash for distribution, so the trust borrowed the money to make the distribution instead of selling trust property. So this is very similar to the Simpleton case. Simpleton took out money for a home, took out a loan from the bank and put it into the business. And the court said that's fine. Bronfman had a trust. And so the beneficiary of the trust says, hey, I'm needing to buy a house. Could you give me some money? And so the trust said, well, we can't liquidate the investments. So the trust took out a loan and gave that money to the beneficiary. They tried to argue that this was kind of the same situation as Simpleton. In the same way that the money was taken into the partnership, this money was put into the trust and then the trust distributed it. So they've input this idea of tracing. We trace the money and for what its use is. So when the money was put back into the partnership, the physical funds were traced to partnership activities. 300,000 went into the bank, and then they paid wages, they invested in a property, they did business-like actions, so it was deductible. But when they traced the money here, the money went into the trust and then straight to the person. It wasn't used for trust activity. The trust was putting itself as a middleman. So they said this goes against the idea of direct use. The tracing, even though it looks like it was directly used in the trust, by tracing the money, it looks like it went straight to the person. So in this situation, the interest was not deductible because borrowed funds not directly used to earn income from property or business. Interest is deductible if a sufficient direct link between borrowed money and current eligible use. One way that a business could deal with tracing is when I take out a large loan, have a second bank account. So the loan comes out, we put it into that bank account, and then with the other bank account, we give money out. So when the argument goes, well, tracing says you gave, no. That money's here. That's where that money was used for legal fees. It was used for salaries. It was used for supplies. The money we gave them was different money. So tracing is very specific about where did the dollars go. When you take that $300,000, if you put it into the same bank account with all of the other business income, it's really hard to trace which dollars were which. And so the court may argue that 300,000 that was given, that's traced to be this loan, it's not deductible. So if you put in metrics, if you put in protective criteria in place within your business so you can trace these specific dollars were spent on these specific things, then that's a good way to protect the deductibility of the interest. Okay, there's more rules around interest as a deduction, but before we get to those to finish up the video, I want to just go to the exercise. Interest deductibility, direct use. You personally own investments valued at 200,000. You also own a home with a mortgage remaining of 200,000. So I have a $200,000 home, I have a $200,000 mortgage, I have investments of $200,000. Because I'm currently holding the mortgage personally, that interest is not deductible. Using the direct use approach, described what you could do to make the mortgage interest deductible. In order to pay off this mortgage, I need $200,000. And I have investments of $200,000. So if I sell those investments, I can take those proceeds, those funds, pay off the mortgage. So now my house is paid off. I have no investments, no loan from the bank, everything's zero. But I want to get those investments back. So if I take that loan back out, $200,000, and now put it into my investments and repurchase all of my investments, now that 200,000 is directly linked to the investments and that interest becomes deductible. So right now I had the mortgage paying interest. I'm paying interest from my mortgage that was used personally. I took my investments, paid off the mortgage. Now that loan's going directly to the investments to repurchase them and is now deductible. I like to do this when in person as more of a sketch, a drawing to help drive this, but it's hard to do on the spreadsheet. But if I can figure out a nice way to do it, maybe I'll post an auxiliary video for this. But generally, those would be the steps. Since you have investments and that mortgage, sell those investments, pay off the mortgage, and then you can re-borrow the funds to repurchase investments. So dollar-wise, you're in the exact same position you were the day before. You still have a loan of 200,000, you still have investments of 200,000, but now you've changed that direct use. So those interest amounts are now deductible. Okay. Other rules around interest as a deduction. We say a disappearing source rule. This applies when borrowed money can no longer be traced to a source of property income because the source ceased to exist. Um, when you buy shares of a corporation, we hope the price will go up, but it doesn't always do that. So if I took a loan of $100,000 and bought some investments, what if the investments lose money? And so now I have investments of $70,000, but a loan of $100,000. So is it still traced? Can I still say that this $100,000 was used for $70,000? So this allows the interest to remain deductible because the disappearing source rule says the investment lost money. It occurs where an individual sells investment as a loss. Money recovered is insufficient to pay off the remaining loan balance. So I got 70,000 for my investments. I paid off my loan of only 70,000. So the loan was $100,000. So there still leaves $30,000 left. But now I have no investments. That 30,000 is no longer connected to anything. I can still deduct the interest from any other property I can still deduct the interest as a property income expense because it was once related to a source of income that's disappeared. So if property is non-depreciable other than real estate, deems borrowed money to still be connected to that source of income. Exceptions. Interest is deductible when borrowed money is used to pay dividends, repurchase redeem shares, or return part of capital equity, called filling the hole. Um, so if I take money from my business and loan it to an individual, I might lose the deductibility of my loan if it looks like loan funds were used for that. The thing is, paying dividends and buying back shares is considered a business activity. So if I've spent some money to give to shareholders and that loan is helping to recover the funds used in that business practice of paying out dividends, then it still retains its deduction status. It retains its ability to be deducted as an expense. Interest-free loans. Interest is borrowed money. So the business takes a loan and then doesn't give it to a shareholder, but loans it to a shareholder. You borrow money to relend to one's own corporation, interest-free or below market rate. Charged to shareholder by bank is deductible. Interest on borrowed money is deductible by corporation if to employees, but not to shareholders. Oh, okay. So what this is saying is if I borrow money from the bank and I put that money into the corporation owes me that money back. So maybe the corporation's paying interest. I can still deduct the bank interest because I've used it for earning income. I've used it for that business practice. If the corporation borrows money and then takes that money and loans it to a shareholder, you can't deduct the interest. It might as well have just been the shareholder loaning the money. But if I loan it to an employee, that loan could be considered part of its benefit package, part of its, the pay package, the compensation, especially if that's the below market interest would be considered a taxable benefit to the employee. So because it's not to a shareholder who's earning income, but is considered a business expense for paying your staff, then it becomes deductible. Common and preferred shares. Preferred shares have preferences that restrict their participation in profits of a corporation to a fixed or stated dividend rate. The fixed dividend rate could be less than the interest charged on the borrowed money. Common shares don't have a fixed income commitment and are reliant on the board of directors to declare a dividend. In extreme cases, common shares may never receive any dividends. So preferred shares, because their dividend rate is stated, the interest charged on the borrowed money to pay out those dividends is deductible. This statement, when I talked about this particular situation, the purpose test, where someone purchased a share for the capital gain, and the court said, well, that share could still get dividends, so it's a source of property income. But companies might be explicit that they will not pay dividends. If a common shareholder is never to receive any dividends, or if it's part of the corporate policy, dividends will not be paid, then there cannot be the expectation of receiving that dividend, and therefore would not be a source of property income. But as long as the corporation doesn't make that claim, it can be argued that even if a company's never paid dividends, the property of that share still is a source of property income because I have a right to the dividends. But if that company says I do not have the right to the dividend, then that removes it as a source of property income. Okay. So let's end it there. I think the next video is probably going to be fairly short. We're going to talk about discounts on debt obligations. Thank you for your time. See you in the next video.